I don't normally talk about this because reading comics wasn't really a cool thing to do, especially back in high school. But I was really into comics. Most of my childhood and even most of my adult life. I collected tons of stuff in my years. And to be brutally honest, I even started a fanzine that published quarterly. And I did that for a couple years. Yeah, I was really into comics. And only a few close friends really knew how deep this obsession went. And I've got boxes and boxes of them that I've lugged from apartment to apartment through my entire adult life. But these comics really kind of defined my childhood, and I've gotten a lot of difficulty letting them go, I suppose. But now looking back, there are definitive issues or even series that I think were masterfully told, beautifully sculpted, and I think really helped develop my sense of great storytelling, as well as fine-tune my own sense of morals and ethics. So with that, let me talk about a couple of my special favorites, I suppose. Now, these are all DC Comics titles, so if you're waiting for somebody to talk about X-Men or the Avengers or how great they are, I'm afraid this isn't the show for you. But first things first, The Crisis on Infinite Earths. This was a huge story, and if you don't know comic books, this is probably the one thing that you should lead up to. And if you know comics, you certainly know the impact that this had in the entire industry. Over the course of its publishing history, DC Comics, also known as National Comics, had acquired a number of different other publishers and properties, including Wiz Comics with its characters of Captain Marvel, better known as Shazam, or even Charlton Comics with their characters of the Blue Beetle and the Question, Captain Atom, which you probably don't really know by name right now, but you probably would better recognize them as the ones that influenced Alan Moore's The Watchmen. And of course, with comic books starting back in the late 30s and into the 40s, there were Golden Age versions of Superman and Batman fighting Hitler on Nazi territory, and then redeveloped into the Silver Age with atomic-inspired heroes and even different versions of that same Superman and Batman. So with all these multiple histories and alternate universes within the DC publishing scope, they created what was called the multiverse. There was Earth 1 for the present day heroes, there's Earth 2 for the heroes that started in wartime era, there was Earth 5 for the Shazam and Wiz Comics characters, but it was getting really confusing, especially for the young audience that were just starting to get into the comics in the 70s. And for the longtime readers, what you're starting to see now are continuity issues. So the big solution that DC Comics came up with was The Crisis on Infinite Earths. The storyline essentially followed the destruction of several different universes and Earths at the hands of this evil anti-monitor. And one by one, an alternate universe was literally erased. The heroes of these multiple Earths banded together to fight against the entropy, eventually leading to the merging of all these different alternate universes. This was a huge story. It took over a year to tell, which was unheard of at the time. This is 1986 roundabout. Heroes were born, heroes died, including Supergirl, and probably more notably the Flash, which was Barry Allen's Flash, the one you're now seeing on television. But what I find most interesting about this series, and why it's probably at the top of my list as the best told story out there, was the background, the behind the scenes story of the publishing entity of DC Comics, and what it was going through with this transparent decluttering of all their properties. For decades afterwards, published stories were defined by either being pre-crisis or post-crisis. So it was that big of a defining line drawn in the sand. And I completely appreciate how DC Comics used their fictional storylines to essentially tell what is happening in a real life business strategy. Okay, so that's probably the biggest and probably my favorite storyline, so which is why I talked about it quite a bit. I'm going to skim over a lot of the other ones here, just highlight some key things that I think you should know. The heels of the crisis, author Roy Thomas was probably in a bit of a bind with his own stories, which were being told in the 40s era wartime series, All-Star Squadron, because now he can no longer include Superman and Batman, which he had been using up until that point. The crisis essentially entirely erased them from that history. And ingeniously, Roy Thomas was the first to ever coin the term, but he used a method called retroactive continuity, better known as retcon. And instead of just removing these characters entirely from the stories, he replaced them with kind of younger versions of what they could have been. And the development of these analog characters led to a personal favorite series of mine called the Young All-Stars. Instead of Superman, you now had Iron Monroe. Instead of Batman, you now had the Flying Fox. Instead of Wonder Woman, you now had the Greek heroine, the Fury. So I really appreciated this type of series for the creativity it was using to establish its heroes in that era. But Roy Thomas was very much a historian as well. Each issue in All-Star Squadron and Young All-Stars were told with very specific dates and very much correlated with what you were seeing in real-time history. Stuff like Pearl Harbor, obviously, or Churchill's visit to Canada. By using these characters and using these storylines, Roy was very much able to deal with relevant social issues of the time. So we're seeing racism in Detroit, or the Japanese internment in Vancouver even. And to be honest, as a child of 10 at the time, I believe I was given a bit of a deeper history of the war and its impact on North American culture. And I appreciated that. I learned probably a deeper history with these comic books than I probably did in school. Also, post-Crisis, author Keith Giffen revamped Justice League as a headline title for DC Comics and quickly became a fan favorite, as well as one of my most treasured reads. Instead of featuring the big names like Superman and Batman, those guys were put off to the side, and he was now using probably more unheard of characters, or ones that were a bit out of the spotlight, like Blue Beetle, Booster Gold, and Black Canary. And the style of writing was very different for the time, and the interactions of the characters were completely different from what you would normally see in previous Justice League incarnations, or Teen Titans, or even X-Men and Avengers. In a revolutionary manner, Keith Giffen introduced humor. And these heroes were flawed. They were humanized. They had egos, for good or bad, and they called themselves by their first names. Humor in comics wasn't brand new, but it certainly wasn't used in any major series. And if you want to thank somebody for influencing, perhaps, great writers like we have today of Joss Whedon, or even the touches of silliness that you're seeing in the Avengers movies, you could easily write a letter to Keith Giffen of DC Comics. His work from the 80s and early 90s is hugely underappreciated. Another series to talk about, which I think was very influential for my appreciation for time-traveling stories, was Armageddon 2001. Published originally in 1991, it told the story of a new hero who's gone back in time to discover the identity of the big bad guy in his present 2001 future. And it was just a collection of what-if stories. What if Superman became the president? What if Batman became a bad guy? That kind of thing. But it was very interesting, and I love the creativity that it unleashed for a lot of the authors at the time. And quickly, another series of note is Timothy Truman's Hawk World. This series really brought up a mirror to the narcissistic, ego-driven Western culture that we had, which seemed to be oblivious to the corruption and sense of entitlement and divide between poverty and wealth. It was a very impactful storyline for me as a kid, because now I'm being forced to address, if only mentally, major serious social issues. Because I'm like 12 years old at the time where I'm really getting deep into this. And that was a very developmental period for me. Now that's just a quick list, and to be honest, I've got thousands of comic books that I hide into a closet, and most of which are hidden onto a shelf. And I could talk about them at length, but I'm going to include some links to some of the storylines that I talked about below in the doobly-doo. And if you do have an interest in any of these, please check them out. I obviously wholly recommend them.